am Beth Berila. I am a professor of ethnic and women's studies and the director of the women's studies program at St. Cloud State University. I'm also a registered yoga teacher and an Ayurvedic yoga specialist. And so I've been teaching women's studies for a long time, and we've of course talked about feminism and social justice for a long time, analyzing social issues and working towards levels of empowerment. But I felt both in my own life and in the lives of my students, there was an embodied piece to that empowerment that was missing. And for me, the path toward that embodied element was yoga and social justice. And so the deeper I went into my own yoga practice and my own yoga training, the more I began to explore what an embodied social justice might look like, right? What would happen when we bring together mindfulness and yoga with social justice, as so many groups and leaders and community activists are doing. And so my most recent work is looking at that integration and how the two practices together really enrich one another and really call the other to accountability. So I've been writing on that. I've been partnering with organizations like Off the Mat Into the World and the Yoga and Body Image Coalition to do this work both inside the university and outside in more broader public spaces.
Okay, fascinating. You used the term embodiment there. Could you explain what that means?
Sure. I mean, on a simple level, embodiment is anything we experience in our bodies. And that can include layers of energetics. It can also include the physiological, the emotional, and the way the emotional impacts our physiology, as well as the intellectual, and even for me, an element of the spiritual. So sort of, I use embodiment to kind of cover a holistic experience of something. And one of the things I was finding in a lot of my university feminist work in the classroom is that there's a great deal of women's studies that focuses really well on the political and the intellectual, and yet the ability to hold that empowerment in our bodies to deal with what would happen when we were in abusive relationships or when we were in sort of toxic situations, that's way more than just intellectual, right? And by the time we get to the intellectual, the ability to speak what is happening, to rationalize, to make sense of what is happening, I think we've missed 3/4 of the journey already. Right? Because we have already been having embodied and emotional experiences that sometimes we don't know how to name, or sometimes they're below the level of our consciousness. And that is where I think mindfulness can become really powerful when combined with the social justice and feminist framework.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more about mindfulness? Like, why is mindfulness the thing that you find helpful there? What about mindfulness is helpful?
Sure. Well, I want to start with a caveat that I don't think it's a silver bullet. I don't think that mindfulness is the key all be all to solve everything. But for me, it was the path to my own embodiment. And mindfulness in a general, I use it as a general term to talk about what a range of practices that can allow us to become more present in the layers of our holistic experiences. So what's happening in our embodiment, what's happening in our physiology, our emotions, our thoughts, our heart center, to be able to witness what's happening, that is, be a little bit bigger than what's happening without drowning in it, getting lost in that experience, and at the same time without disassociating, right? Completely disconnecting from our experiences. So I use the term mindfulness to be able to cultivate the skills and the capacity to both recognize and sit with whatever is happening for us in the present moment, without judgment. And for me, as I've said, the practices that have gotten me there are yoga and meditation, but there are a lot of other practices that can fall under the framework of mindfulness. And that's one of the reasons why I use the term mindfulness instead of yoga or meditation, so that it can be more open for which practices really resonate with different people.
Okay. It's just one term I just picked up of what you said. I don't know if it's an important term. If it isn't, ignore the question. But you said something about mindfulness helps us deal with the layers of our experience.
the layers.
Or the layers of our, I don't remember what it was layers of experience, layers of identity, layers of, you used the term layers, which I found interesting.
Mm-hmm.
If that's an important thing, could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Well, I suppose one of the reasons I started thinking about layers is because I feel like there's a lot going on in our experiences of the world before we get to the ability to verbalize it and to make sense of it through our intellect. So, for instance, when we have a gut reaction, if something is happening, an oppressive situation, and an experience in which we feel marginalized or targeted, for instance, we are often reacting to it immediately before we necessarily even know that we're reacting to it. So our heart might be racing. We may, our emotions like anger or fear might come up, and all the sort of physiological components that go with that. And it may be, I think it takes longer for us to be able to name what's happening, or even be able to articulate it in any kind of coherent way. And by the time we get there, we've already been in our embodied experiences for a while. And I often felt that in women's studies, and I'm just using women's studies as an example, there are many higher education disciplines that do the same, because higher ed often focuses on the intellect, right? Not every discipline, certainly performance studies, dance, some places don't, but in general, there's a focus on the intellect. And yet we're all having these embodied experiences from moment to moment. And if we don't learn how to make sense of those things, then we'll be reacting to them instead of intentionally engaging them. And also we won't be able to heal them because we don't know that they're going on, and we don't know where they're coming from. And so especially when we're talking about social justice, marginalized communities are living in a state of what some people would call a really hyper-vigilant nervous system all the time, because oppression is coming at marginalized communities constantly. And so their awareness of it is heightened at every moment. And this is a whole nother body of work, but basically if you live in the world with a really heightened nervous system, that takes its toll on you. And so how do we name that? How do we heal that? How do we address that layer, as well as the wider conditions that are creating the need for that in the first place? And then how do we look at the fact that some communities don't have to do that because they're privileged, they're not targeted in that way. So those are the kinds of connections that I started to make between what yoga and meditation communities are offering, especially in this case with what I just talked about, trauma-sensitive yoga communities, and what we've been talking about in social justice and feminist circles for a long time. So bringing those together.
Just out of interest, what's the trauma-sensitive yoga community?
What? I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
What is a trauma-sensitive yoga community?
Oh, sure. So I guess I wanted to specify that not all yoga studios, classes, communities necessarily deal with issues of trauma. But there's a growing awareness, at least in the communities that I'm aware of here in the United States, that many communities deal with trauma, whether we're talking about people who've experienced genocide on a cultural level, whether we're talking about sexual assault survivors or veterans, right, coming back from war. Lots of people deal with trauma. And yoga can be incredibly healing for dealing with things like PTSD and the wounds from trauma, but you can't teach it to those communities in the same way that you would teach to a sort of public class, because certain things will be really triggering, like touching someone without their permission or without their knowledge, or coming up behind someone, or certain poses might feel really vulnerable in a way for someone who's experienced trauma than for someone who hasn't. And so there are particular programs that train people on how to be more, there are two different terms, trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed. I won't go into the difference there, but basically so that you're more aware of what can come up for people with trauma, and that you tailor the practices accordingly so that they can be restorative and healing instead of triggering.
Interesting. A little off topic, but very interesting.
Sure.
So with all this, are there any, so what are the challenges to implementing that stuff? And are there any dangers or any drawbacks maybe to use mindfulness in these settings or in these ways?
Sure. Well, I just talked about one of the dangers, which is that you can't, if you're dealing with a really vulnerable populations, a group that is likely to have experienced trauma, you can't teach yoga in the same way that, at least like for instance, the way that I learned in my 200-hour yoga teacher training to teach in public classes, that there's a lot of things that I was taught that would not be appropriate for communities that are dealing with trauma. And the thing to remember though, if we're talking about oppression, is that in any given room, you've got someone dealing with trauma, right? So you don't have to be in a specific class for a specific targeted community to have to deal with these issues, right? So that's one. I guess another thing is that you can't sort of wholesale drop it into different spaces without intentionally thinking about what kind of support is a community going to need to be able to navigate mindfulness in a productive way. So if you're going to ask communities to get vulnerable, which mindfulness practices often ask you to do, then there's a couple things to consider. Number one, if you've got a marginalized person, let's say it's a person of color, or let's say it's an LGBTQ queer person, and they're in a space where they're the only one there, or they think they're the only one there, and they're surrounded by what are probably more privileged people, then the likelihood of them feeling safe enough to do these practices in any kind of vulnerable way is really slim, right? Also, sometimes things can come up while doing the meditation that can be really rich, but you need to make sure that the group or the person has the resources around them to safely explore those issues, right? Or to safely explore whatever comes up. You can't just take someone into a deep, vulnerable experience, and if they are willing and able to go there, then say, bye-bye, sorry, our time is up. And then they're like gone out into the world without the necessary support to process through whatever has arisen, right? I think one of the other components that comes up in a lot of mindfulness circles and yoga circles, and I don't know what it's like in the UK, but one of the things that has worried me quite a bit in mindfulness and yoga circles here in the US is this tendency to want to create this kind of universal sameness. Like mindfulness can make us all feel connected, and isn't this great that we're all one? And the problem with that is that we're not all one right now, not in the world that we live in, right? And often what I find is that when someone says something like what I just said, like, but there are barriers to our connections, and those barriers are coming from social oppression that I'm targeted by that you're not, maybe, right? People in mindfulness circles who get uncomfortable with that sometimes go to the, but why can't we be all one, right? As a way to bypass the difficult work, right? And I think ultimately we are all human, and the desire is to be fully connected. So it's a beautiful ultimate desire, but we need to get there through our differences, not around them, right? We need to do the hard work so that we can really honor our differences, let everybody show up with their full authenticity without targeting some people more than others in order to get to that wholeness and that oneness. But too often what I see happen is that that concept is used to try to bypass the work.
It's interesting. It's very interesting. Is there anything else you'd like to say, sort of on the theoretical level, or is there is it time for the exercises or practices?
Well, I think that we can move into the practices, but let me give you a little bit of context for them.
Yes, of course.
In our discussions, we were talking about, which elements of social justice maybe I would want to talk about. And one of the things that came to the surface is something you might be interested in, is the idea of intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
And since I don't assume that everybody who watches this know what intersectionality is, I thought I'd talk very briefly about what it is.
Yes.
So it's a concept that was coined by the feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, who was building on the work of many community activists and social justice workers long before. And it basically allows us to talk about how all the different facets of our identity come together to create kind of a unique recipe of identity for each and every one of us, right? So it's how our gender identity and our racial identity and ethnic identity, national identity, sexual identity, class, disability, and any other operative, salient identity categories come together to create a unique combination for each of us. And one of the reasons Kimberly Crenshaw really felt that that was important was because in the legal work she was doing, she was really working to advocate for women of color. And she was exploring cases where women of color were saying they were marginalized and discriminated against in the workplace because they were women of color. And the courts were saying, well, you can't be discriminated against because look, this company hires women and you're a woman. And look, this company hires people of color and you're a person of color. Therefore, you can't be discriminated against. But what both of those things were doing were missing the intersection of how they were women of color. And so those policies didn't address that. And so their marginalization was kind of slipping through the cracks, right? The courts wouldn't recognize it. And so it becomes really important to look at the combination of our identities. Because, for instance, if we're going to deal with sexism, for instance, I'm a woman, I'm also white, middle class, and queer. So my experience of sexism looks a particular way. Right? A upper class Chicana woman's experience of sexism is going to look different, as is a middle class American Indian woman's experience, right? So if we're really going to do away with sexism, we need to look at all the different manifestations of it. Right? The other thing that intersectionality lets us do, as other scholars have built on it, Patricia Hill Collins, for instance, it lets us look at the ways that our complex identities mean that there can be ways in which we are privileged and ways in which we are marginalized. Right? So again, I'll just use myself as an example. I'm marginalized because I'm queer and I'm a woman, but I'm middle class, which makes me pretty normative in US culture anyway, and I'm white and able-bodied at the moment, and I'm a US citizen. So there are lots of ways in which I'm privileged at the same time that I'm also marginalized. And so that gives us a more complex way of looking at power, and also a more complex way of looking at our relationship with other people in our communities, right? But it's important to remember that we're all those things all the time, right? We don't walk in the door and one day we're gendered, and then the next day we're raced, and the next day we're class, right? We're all those things all the time. But which parts of our identities become most salient may shift based on context, right? So if I'm in a predominantly straight space, for instance, and it's really clear that they're not welcoming to LGBTQ people, then that part of my identity might percolate to the surface as being really operative right now, right? Even though I'm all those things all the time. It may be less operative in other spaces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just wanted to put that out there for people who weren't sure. And so this first practice is a way for us to reflect on both what our own identities are and then how that operates during our lives. Right? And then I'll share a different experience with us if that's okay. Okay, so I'm going to ask people to have some paper or journal next to them and a pen. And I'm going to ask you to just answer some questions for yourself, because you may not be aware of all these things. So take a minute and ground yourself. Feel the chair or the earth beneath you supporting yourself. And take a few deep cleansing breaths. Just to bring your awareness to the here and the now. Each exhale, letting go of any stresses of your day so far. And that you can bring your awareness fully present with us right now. Breathe into your heart center. So that as we engage this reflection, we do it with compassion and a connection to our heart. So as I ask you these questions, you can either stay with your eyes closed if that works for you, turning inward and just mentally answer, or you can write in your journal, keeping your focus still soft and as inward as you can. So let's take a moment and reflect on our own identities. How would you identify your gender identity? Your racial identity? How would you describe your ethnic identity? Your sexual identity? Your economic class identity? Disability identity? Ability or disability differently able? Religious or cultural identity? Your tribal identity, if that's relevant to you? Your national identity? And any other operative categories of your identity that are really important to you? Now imagine all of those facets of your identity kind of creating a rich web around you with their center, their connecting, their intersecting point at your navel center. They all come together in you at your navel center. Stand or exist, be strong in that center. Now imagine that you're on a paddleboard, right? Those flat surfboard kind of things that people sometimes use to float in water. If that feels comfortable to you, imagine that you're on one of those. The water can be really shallow. And so to keep afloat on a paddleboard, you have to kind of be able to shift your weight back and forth Even maybe feel yourself do that in your sit bones right now, even if you're just sitting, as though the water were floating under you. You're shifting back and forth, forward and back, to kind of keep your center of gravity in your navel center. And imagine that the water around you is your daily existence. The things you go through when you go to the grocery store, when you go to work, when you're at home. That's your community and environment around you. You're always on your paddleboard with your center of gravity in that connection of your identity. How does that paddleboard shift? How does the water move as you go through your day? Where does it invite you or challenge you to emphasize or de-emphasize parts of your identity? So when you're with your family, you find yourself putting more weight of your Christian identity or ethnic identity. You find yourself downplaying your sexual identity or other aspects. How does your weight shift based on context of your day? I wish as you visualize moving through your day, you can even shift your body a little bit, or which parts of your identity you need to dial up or dial down. Protection, for belonging. And bring your awareness back to your navel cord, that place where all the parts of you come together in the authenticity that is you. And feel yourself standing in that paddleboard or inhabiting that paddleboard with full balance, embracing the whole of you, regardless of what the wider community wants you to do. Know that you are always that wholeness. Come back to your heart center. Holding with some compassion whatever it is you might have noticed. When you're ready, gently come back into the room. Maybe open your eyes if you've closed them. And let your gaze stay soft as you gently come back.
Hey.
If you wish, you can journal some of the reflections, and if somebody wants to do that, you can obviously make the meditation longer in the reflection part if you wish.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have that written down somewhere too, in case people want to, or are you happy for us to make a little transcript of it? Yeah, because it would be nice for people to also have that down as something they can download and then maybe do with a group or something like that.
Yeah, you know, I came up with a paddleboard idea, and I'm actually not a paddleboarder. I've only done it once. But I came up with the metaphor when I was talking with some students who were really processing the ways that their complex identities sometimes fragmented them. And so they were talking, this particular conversation was with uh, some African students, some immigrant students from Somalia, from Ethiopia, and from some other countries who were talking about sort of, which parts of them got most marginalized when they were on campus, and how they behaved differently when they were at home, but then other parts of themselves got marginalized. And so, like, how did they find some balance, and which parts did they sort of need to dial up or dial down, right? But then how can that sometimes come with a cost to the person who's being asked to do that constantly? And so that idea of, like, you're all those things all the time, but you're being asked to sort of put your emphasis in different places or de-emphasize, and sort of to just become really conscious of that, how that operates in your life. And then once you become conscious of it, you can take the next step of figuring out what you want to do about it. But also that practice of recognizing and embracing the holistic part of you, right? Even when society around you doesn't want to do that.